I presented this yesterday, so some of you might have seen my slides from yesterday, so I'll keep it really brief, and I'll definitely be focusing more on the experimental and implementation efforts that has been gone in doing this research. So without further ado, I'll start. Well, I'll just to very briefly mention that this is a joint collaboration between me, myself, and a lot of other researchers, Scott, Erjun, and Gene from UCI, and Andrew from Microsoft. So I'll just quickly talk about GDPR and CCPA. I'm pretty sure you already know a lot about this, but the main benefit of having these data protection regulation is that it provides us with legal capabilities of asking these businesses that collect our data to provide us with access, modification or deletion of these data. And these are GDPR and CCPA are not the only ones that are coming out. There are a lot of other countries and a lot of regions within the same country trying to provide the same protection. However, because if you want to, because of the nature of this data, it's really necessary for the businesses to authenticate these consumers, because if you provide access to the wrong consumer, you will be providing with, a potentially privacy-sensitive data to that person. So in order to authenticate these consumers, what they would have to provide is something called a verifiable consumer request, or VCR for short. So it's very easy for consumers to be able to authenticate if they have an account on these websites. So if they're logged in and then they visit the website, they just have to provide the same login information and say, hey, I'm the rightful owner. I'm the one who was visiting the website at this time. Please give me access to this data. However, GDPR and CCPA actually also provides the same rights to the people who do not have an account on these websites. So let's say you are not logged in, or you just simply don't have an account, or you're using incognito mode and you're visiting a website. GDPR and CCPA allows you to exercise the same rights that consumers who have accounts can exercise. So you might be wondering, okay, so how do you even authenticate these consumers? Well, it's really ad hoc these days, and it's a lot of the solutions that were provided are insecure or privacy invasive at best. So that's why we wanted to propose VICEROY. So VICEROY is a framework that allows accountless consumers to securely and privately exercise their GDPR and CCPA data protection rights. And I will not go too much into detail what VICEROY is, but I will definitely give you a brief overview of how a VICEROY operates, because this will kind of lead to the implementation efforts that we have put into. So VICEROY consists of three entities: a trusted consumer device or trusted client device, where it stores a secret key. And then there's a client device, which you do your normal browsing activities. It could be your laptop or it could be your desktop. And then there's a server, which you would interact with, which would give you the services that you are accessing. So VICEROY consists of three steps. The first is the setup phase. What happens is that the consumer will bring its trusted consumer device. It would then generate a master private key. And from this master private key, it would communicate to its regular consumer device and generate a device unique public key. Now, what happens in the next phase is that you are just browsing the internet, and in this case, you don't have to, use your trusted consumer device anymore. What happens is that the consumer device would use this device unique public key to generate a session unique public key, and then send it over to the server. The server would then generate something called a cookie wrapper and send it back to the consumer. A cookie wrapper is essentially a digital signature over a fresh public key and the cookie for this particular session. Note that this is done over TLS. We do have a version of things that do not happen on TLS in our paper, but let's assume that everything happens on TLS for this particular case. So it is. Oh, okay, cool. So as you have seen, we have generated a lot of keys. So we have a device unique public key, we have master private key, we have a session private key. How does a consumer even manage all these keys? What we use in our system is something called the derivable asymmetric key, and a very unique, well, not unique, very well-known implementation of this is called BIP32, or Bitcoin Improvement Proposal 32. And what this allows us to do is to generate public keys from public keys without the need of secret keys. And I'll show you how that works in a little bit of animation right here. So remember we had this red public key, master private key. What this protocol can do is that it could generate a device unique public key, as we have seen the blue public key. And then from this blue public key, it can generate a session specific key, like the green public key that and then this would allow us to not involve the master private key when we generate the session keys. And this is very unique because we don't need the master private key in existence when we are just doing the normal operations, which improves the security immensely. Also, I will show in the next slide, when you need the private key counterpart of the public key, we can also generate that from the master private key as well. So I will now focus more on the implementation part. Probably this is what we are all here for. We have implemented VICEROY from end to end. So basically, we have implemented the trusted consumer device, the consumer device, and the server, and then we have taken experience from all across the area. And I would like to highlight that I also have it here. This is the actual device that we implemented on, and this is probably the most important part of VICEROY implementation, and I'll be talking a lot about this key. This is the trusted consumer device that I was talking about in the previous slides. So yeah, keep that in mind. Okay, so let me talk more about this key. This is called a Solokey. Does anyone know about this key? I just raise a hand. Okay, so there's one person who knows. Anyone else? Okay, so other person. No? Okay, so two people.
Is it related to a UV key?
Yes, that's I think that's a very good question. So the difference between the Solokey and the UV key is that UV keys are locked in a sense that you cannot upload your own firmware or code or customized application on top of it. However, this one is very unique because it's all open sourced in a sense. It has the bootloader is open source, the firmware is open source, and even the hardware schematics are open source. Unfortunately, not the CPU, but I mean, you have to make a little bit of compromise, right? But compared that to YubiKey, where everything is locked, it's very, very nice to be able to work on this. So our first intention, when we're implementing VICEROY was that, hey, let's use YubiKey, right? Because everyone knows YubiKey. If we can use YubiKey to implement VICEROY, that will be a huge impact. But that's when we were looking into the implementation, we hit a roadblock, and that's probably one thing that what I want to say here is that in the future, if anyone wants to implement something that's related to FIDO2 or something like that, Solokey would be a great partner for you. Okay. But let me talk about a little bit of what Solokey is. So this is something called the Solokey 1. There's a later version called Solokey 2, but I don't have that. But the Solokey I will be talking about Solokey 1 for the rest of my presentation. So the specs are a pretty minimal. It has an ARM CPU that runs an 80 megahertz, and the RAM is, I think 64 kilobytes. Yeah, 64 kilobytes of RAM and 256 kilobytes of ROM. So it's very, very limited. So this actually raises a lot of interesting questions, which I'll probably talk about in the next slide. Yes. So the challenges of using Solokey was that, well, first of all, the documentation. Solokey developers are really good. They have a lot of documentation, but it's sort of scattered around the internet. So like you have to dive in and, kind of like swim through all the information and collect all the necessary information in order to develop your application on top of this. So some of them are scattered in GitHub. Some of them are scattered on their official documentation. In one case, we actually had to go through the GitHub issues one by one to understand how do I even get solve this issue. So that was one of the key challenges that we have to face. The second challenge is definitely limited resources. Like I said, it's not like your regular, Intel CPU or like, really high-grade ARM CPUs. This is just runs on 80 megahertz. It only has a very small amount of RAM and ROM. So one thing to take into consideration is, okay, what is going to be the experimental results? Like, what kind of latency am I going to be seeing if I'm going to be using this, right? Another thing is, can I even upload my code on top of what already is uploaded onto this key? That's another big challenge as well. We also wanted to make our protocol as an extension of FIDO2. So we sort of also needed to have that interface available while keeping our this key available to run our VICEROY code as well. So that's mostly the biggest challenges that we faced, and I'll be talking a little bit of like how we sort of fixed them or overcame them one by one. So about the documentation, right now we have our entire implementation code open sourced on our official GitHub repo, and there's one one big README file that you can go through one by one, and then that would help you to set up the environment, build all the firmware that you need to do, and then also has a couple of like nice instructions of like, okay, what happens if I go into this kind of like, theme? What is this, instruction? What does this do? Or how do I even debug using, this hardware token? So we have a lot of these things in our README file, which I am hoping that it's, helpful. But also at the same time, there are a lot of things that are still missing. So I'm always open. We're always open for like an additional feedback, and then like if the community can come back and it's like, you're missing this, you should add this into the README, we were happy to do so. The limited resources part, we actually had to put our code onto a diet, so to say. We had to shave off a lot of things in order to for us to put the entire code base for VICEROY into this small token. We also had to like sort of make our a little bit of like on the fly implementation. For example, like the fact that VICEROY only uses one master private key actually worked to our favor, because we actually didn't need to have an entire like hundreds and thousands of keys stored inside this small flash memory. We just only need to store one, and that like actually helped a lot. So this might be a little bit unique to VICEROY, and some other people who might want to be using Solokey might face a different issue than we faced. So the CPU frequency can only be measured through latency. So I'll be talking a little bit about the experiments. So the master private key generation is not that slow on the token. It's like about several hundreds of milliseconds. And the generation of the device unique public key is also not that slow as well. It's slow compared to like, several tens of milliseconds, but still it's not in the order of, tens of seconds or something like that. So we would consider this sort of acceptable. The the generation, the unique thing of, VICEROY is that we don't have any sort of generation of, we don't require the Solokey when we are visiting websites. So this is actually really good because, we don't, the latency for our regular browsing activities is very minimal. So, the user will not be facing a lot of issues when they're using VICEROY. However, the key challenge comes when we actually are generating the VCR requests. So what happens is that we have to use this VC token. We have to plug it in, ask it to generate the VCR for us, and that takes about 1.3 seconds. So this was sort of unexpected, and we were like, why is this so slow? But we couldn't do anything on top of that because this was already optimized. Our code was already optimized. We sort of accepted this as, okay, this is going to be our latency. And sort of, we didn't consider it as a failure, but we definitely could have improved better. But we were like hit of like a time limit as well. So we said, okay, let's just submit this to NDSS and let's see whether the reviewers like it or not. Thankfully, they said, okay, so I'm here right now. But we could have done better. And I think that's definitely something that is could reflect as a future improvement. That will be something that we would be like to look into. Okay, this is actually my last slide, but like I said, everything is open sourced, and everything would be very it would be, I would be very, very happy if you could give us feedback based on GitHub, through GitHub issues and all that on sorts. But yeah, that will be mostly for for this presentation. But I guess the next part would be engaging into discussion into everyone, right? Yeah. So for those of you who have used Solokey, did my presentation make sense, or did you see something that was a little bit off, or anything that kind of triggered something that was unique to my presentation?
Sorry, one question that I had was regarding the 1.3 seconds. Is it, do you have a sense of why that is long?
The VCR generation?
Yeah. No, the proof.
The proof generation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it like a bottleneck on the Tamarind prover, or is it like a bottleneck from the systems?
No. The proof generation happens on this key. So this is the bottleneck, definitely. Tamarind is not in that part. But definitely the bottleneck is the CPU frequency and the small amount of RAM that it can use to generate the security proofs. We are using a standard digital signature, like an RSA signature. So that's another reason why it's so slow. Yeah. So that's another sort of and the thing that happened, probably the bottleneck inside here. Yes.
So I was curious on that as well. For the performance there, you said they're using RSA signatures.
Yeah.
Is that, I guess that's sort of a nice thing, because it sounds like there's a lot of sort of easy wins there, right? You change the signature, you change the key size.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually didn't look into changing the key sizes. We, like I said, we only have a very small amount of RAM here. So we can only store a very limited amount of key. So we can't have an increased size key. We only have a short key. With that being said, I thought that would kind of be beneficial for us because we would see a very low latency. But even with a short key, we were seeing a long latency. So I cannot imagine how long it would be if we had a longer key, for example, for that supports RSA 2048 or something like that. Also, another limitation is the fact that we use BIP32, and BIP32 also has a very unique set of keys that it can generate. The randomness it has is very specific, so that it will only be able to generate keys at a certain length. And that was also another limitation for VICEROY as well. Yeah. Well, for this implementation, actually, VICEROY is agnostic, but yeah.
Gotcha. I had sort of maybe an unrelated question. I think it's a really cool technique, and I was wondering, so for us, we're all about hardware roots of trust, right? Like I use my YubiKey for everything, but the average consumer, for them, usually their root of trust is, their phone or their, the device itself. So I'm curious, do you see these techniques like generalizing toward, using, like the personal device as the root of trust?
Oh, yes, definitely. That's actually a great point. So the reason why we wanted to use this is because we know for a fact that this is going to be like our most resource limit, our less powerful device. So our latency that we see here is like 1.3 seconds. That's probably as high as it gets. So once you start to use your phones or your laptops, then the latency would definitely go down. And VICEROY, the unique part of VICEROY is that the trusted consumer device does not have to be like a separate device like this. It could be your second smartphone. It could be actually your own laptop that you're browsing on top of. So based on your security and privacy preferences, you can change what your trusted consumer device is going to be. And based on that, you would experience different latencies. And I think I would like to note there that we actually didn't measure that. And I think that would be a very straightforward extension for our experiments as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks. I think Filippo. Okay.
I think to follow up on that, like, what are some experiments you wish you could have run, and like, why didn't you? Like, what? Like, if you had more, if everyone's like, if I had extra months on the deadline, like, what would I, and unlimited pages, what would you wish you could put in there, and tell us about that?
There's so much stuff that we wanted to do. So first of all, I think one of the, I've kind of mentioned that in the previous question, I would have loved to measure cases where we have a more stronger consumer device, what would be the latency. And that would also be a very nice convincing factor of like, hey, we can do a lot of things we can support a lot of trusted consumer devices. Another factor is that we actually didn't support a lot of devices. Like our device was just like like a laptop and something like that. It was geared towards to that, specifically because we wanted to just measure a regular consumer device, but we didn't have like a wide range, so we don't have like a lot of okay, so this is going to be like what you would normally see, and if you don't see that, there's something wrong in your experimental results. Yes.
Could you please go back to the slide where you were showing the different numbers? So how did you what kind of experimental setup did you use in order to come up with these particular timings?
Yes. I also wanted to mention that when Jared was asking me as well, the setup we did here was just we have the server on the same laptop, we had the client on the same laptop, we sent the requests over within the same device. This is just to limit the network latency, and obviously because network latency would be experienced by in different magnitudes by different consumers, so we kind of wanted to remove that out. But one thing that I kind of regret not doing for my NDSS paper is that we don't have an automated system for measuring and reproducing the results. This is because, as you can see, we have a lot of different entities involved, and also within the consumer device, you can see here, we have different things that have to interact with each other. So because we have, this is based on like web applications, it's not easy to interact with this hardware token. Even though we say we extend upon FIDO2, FIDO2 is not like, the native, native support for FIDO2 in most of the browsers are very limited. They only support like a handful of arguments or access. So we actually extended it, so therefore, the browser would not understand our commands. So we actually have to implement a web plugin, a web extension, and then use that to communicate with our custom API
Right. On your next slide, I think you had a figure around the Solokey. So did you actually...
This one?
Yes. So how did you come up with the proof measurement?
Oh, right. That's actually a good point too. We initially wanted to measure on top of this, but obviously measuring on top of this would, pose a lot of more limitations, especially because you're using CPU cycles and that's not good. So we sort of inferred it by measuring from the consumer device that it's plugged into. So our laptop was the main entity that measured it.
Yeah. Did you talk about that in the NDSS paper?
No, we didn't. This is very unique to this workshop, yes.
All right. I guess I'm a little surprised that the reviewers didn't ask about that, or perhaps they did.
They did, but they didn't go into too much into the detail. The implementation effort was not widely appreciated. Although we spent so much time implementing this and getting this ready, and we have also open source as in an anonymous way when we were doing our review cycles. The reviewers more focused on the security aspects. They're pointing out, okay, what about this problem? What about that problem? We're okay, we were busy replying to that. We didn't go into the other aspects.
Thanks. This is for people, right? So as a usable security researcher, obvious low-hanging fruit is adoption. For the first thing. Second thing, to David's point, delay is an irksome thing for a user, especially for immersive applications. So that means that there's I have two questions. The first question is threshold of adaptation. How too much of a friction is the Solokey? And second is last year on SUPS, we ran a workshop on inclusive privacy. Mm-hmm. I had a paper with a partially blind student who did this study to see how blind students and blind people and people with disabilities use or can't use this kind of 2FA security. So that might be a niche, accessibility might be a niche, but I think it's also important because GDPR also applies to them. So your comments, I'm more interested into that. All good and well, right? But privacy is always sacrificed on the very friction of time in immersion. So please see if you can comment on that.
Oh yes, that's actually a very good point. So first about the adoption friction, that I think one of the reviewers for NDSS did bring it up once. And we I think we discussed it, but it kind of faded away compared to the other more pressing issues. I think our general consensus between the authors were that this is not strictly necessary. And I think one of the questions was, okay, can't you use your smartphone or your laptop instead? And as I've also I would like to repeat that what I've answered to that question. This is not strictly necessary. You could use your own smartphone and your laptop, depending on your preference of security and privacy. And that actually goes into your point where, okay, you are sacrificing privacy and security. Is that good or bad or not? I think the short answer is I don't know. I think that will be the follow-up the research. Probably, we're putting the decision to the people's hands. If they want to use that, they can use it. Now, I think the second question about visual impaired, users, whether we can support this or not, that's a very, very, very difficult question. We didn't actually think about it, and I would have to admit that I'm a bit, ashamed that we didn't consider it, but. That's something that, if we are to improve on top of what we have right now and conduct a further study, probably a usable security study would be a great a natural next point for us.
There is no point for you to be sorry about it. Inclusion security has many things to come in, and this workshop has to happen multiple times in the future. If we solve everything today, then but interesting point on the experimentation. Then, if to your discussion that this can be applied in multiple modalities, then what is your opinion of kind of burning first the users to try this and then telling them, oh, there is an easy way to make them anyhow use. Like anchoring them into an experience that it's kind of a little bit rough, but then also letting them something more immersive on the browser, and then kind of having them adopt it through to that kind of. We can talk afterwards, but that's much more to do, is because it's not necessarily dear to people who are affected by GDPR, but
But I mean, deployability is a very pressing issue. If no one is going to be using this, then what's the whole point of presenting this, proposal, protocol, right? So I think that's a very valid question, and we do have a little bit of discussion about how can we deploy this in the nature. How easy it is to for like the current environment to use this in the entire in the internet.
Yes, simple experiment question. So these timing numbers, are these averages, or are they? How many times did you measure them, or what's the variability of the measurements?
That's a great question. We measured 10 times, and this is an average of the 10 times. Because we are measuring on the same laptop in the same environment, we didn't see a lot of variance. So the average is mostly what you would see all the time. Although I think, one thing to point out, I didn't mention about this, but another manual aspect of this entire experimental effort was we had to use a HAR file in order to understand how much data has been transferred. This is actually a very big hassle for our experiments. We also used a HAR file for a different set of experiments in our different paper. But I think that's one of the big things that we sort of could not come up with a better solution. We don't know how to measure the amount of data that's being transferred and on the web application level, other than using these HAR files. Does anyone know anything better than this? I haven't seen anything. Do you? Okay.
So I just had a follow-up question on that. So
okay.
The question I guess you're asking is what's the marginal additional data transfer needed to convey this portion of the data?
Well, I mean, the amount of data that's being transferred while using the protocol, we could only use a HAR file to extract that information. We do not know a better way to do this. I just wanted to quickly see whether anyone knows a better way of doing it. Apparently, Wireshark. But Wireshark is in the network level. We could measure the payload, but it's not it concludes HTTP headers and all that kind of stuff. We could kind of cut it down, but
you should be able to, if you capture it, you should be able to reconstruct the conversation and just extract out that data itself.
Can we also automate using that too?
Yeah, you can just run it. And I guess a follow-up question I had is, did a human actually click and use the website? And did you look at maybe using a headless browser, I don't remember exactly what they're called, Chromium, or WebDriver, where you could automate some aspects of that so you didn't have to physically click it every single time?
No, we actually do have to control on control. We have to reload. That's another aspect that we didn't automate. I think this is pretty unique to web application and these kind of areas of research. I really appreciate that. We didn't actually had the thought of using headless browsers and automating the aspect of reloading the websites. So that's a great feedback.
I don't think actually doing it by hand was a wrong thing. I would it would be interesting to report the result of here's how humans did it, and then maybe to get a tighter bound on some of the things that might have the mechanical aspects, then using an automated browser to get nice clean range.
Right. I'm a bit more concerned about the reproducibility, because asking a person who wants to reproduce this experiment, tell them to do Control R 10 times, and then measure the amount of data that is being reported on the terminal is really bad compared to just run this shell script and just copy what you see here on the terminal at the end. I think that's much more better for reproducibility. That's also another reason why I'm asking about like, can we do better than HAR? And I think Wireshark might help a little bit in that aspect.
Are you going to release the HAR files?
I'm sorry?
Are you going to publish the HAR files?
I don't think we are, because it has a little bit of additional information that we don't want to be releasing.
Okay.
Yeah, we might want to release the cutout version, but it's a bit difficult to manipulate the HAR file. So that's another reason too, because if you have like a Wireshark file, you can just like cut off all the unnecessary stuff probably.
Great discussion. I had a number of questions that I wanted to ask, and everyone has already asked them, and so that's wonderful. We've got a few more minutes here, so I see one more question. I also wanted to check and see if Lara on Zoom, if you had any questions or comments for Yoshi?
I don't have any questions like you. I had some questions about the evaluation, and like the number of trials run and things like that, but people have already asked those and drilled down. This has been a great discussion. So, please keep it up.
All right, couple more minutes. We've got one more question, and then I've got a few things I want to ask in order to wrap up.
Yeah, so going on that like automation track, instead of using a headless browser, what's preventing us from using like a wget or a curl even?
Oh no, that's that's definitely that's doable.
I guess you have to design all the header stuff.
Yeah, I mean we designed everything so that a person could use.
Yeah.
So when you want to have something that when a person could use and you want to automate it, that's a bit of a different challenge. And I think that's like another dilemma that we also reached as well, because we were like, okay, we want to make this reproducible, but how are we gonna? So unfortunately on the GitHub repo, we don't have any instructions on the experiments. And I think that's like a huge limitation, especially because I'm standing in front of here talking about experimental efforts. I think another thing that I have to do, go back to UCI, is to write down like the experimental like list of how to reproduce the results, at least for a manual aspect, and then ask for additional maybe inputs for automation. Sorry.
Yeah, you've gotten a lot of great feedback and suggestions here. I would encourage you, when you get back to your seat, immediately jot it all down so you don't forget it.
Yes.
And then think about what your one of my questions is, what are your next steps? Sort of what's your research plan moving forward? And clearly you can incorporate all of this feedback and suggestions into that. But it sounds like you still have a lot of at least experimental work you could do around this, as well as extending your idea. So your thoughts on next steps?
Yes. So my thoughts would be incorporate all the feedback that I got, especially about the using the Wireshark headless browsers, and having a little bit more automated interactions between the entities, to at least make some portion of the experiment automated. Unfortunately, I think this part cannot be automated. You need to have access to this, or at least I can try to find something like an emulated
would it make sense to experiment with alternatives to that?
That's the difficult part too. All the evaluation or implementation is specific to this particular token. If we can make it sort of like simulated, I think they released a simulator for Solokey, so I have to look that into that as well. But I mean, so
or also a mobile phone.
Oh, your mobile phone as well. Yes, definitely. So I think that will be the next step of that, to incorporate as much devices as possible for the trusted consumer device, your laptop or your phone, and then that would then lead to a more better adoption of VICEROY, and that would be great.
I encourage you to, as I do for everyone who's presenting today, to write a paper for Laser. Keep in mind, this is it's not going to a program committee, and so it's not going through a process where it's either going to be accepted or not accepted. Instead, Lara drives an ad hoc review process similar to what you would do with a journal article. So it'll go out to at least 2, maybe 3, possibly 4 different reviewers with knowledge and expertise in this area. You could write a paper that focuses on the experimental aspects and takes all the feedback and questions that you received this morning and incorporates that, and could even describe what your research plan is moving forward. I think that would make for a really good laser paper in terms of what you've already done, your prototype, the experimentation you did, the limitation it has, the range of possibilities, and a research plan for how you might move that forward. I think would fit very nicely.